I'm now recording so that we can review all of this and post it in various places. Steve, would you like to introduce and also set a time box for this video? Let's decide how long our video will be and how much time we have to explore this conversation together.
So we are going to use a website called Vote. What's it called, David?
Vote Compass.
And that is a website purportedly which asks about a series about 30 questions, and at the end of that tells you in any particular election, and they have different elections fed in here, which candidate you're most aligned with. So David and I, being the intellectual giants that we are going to have a conversation. We're going to go through those 30 questions and come up with answers, and then we will decide who the next premier of Saskatchewan should be.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the election, I think the polls probably just closed. Is it?
I believe so.
8 p.m. in Saskatchewan? So at the end of this video, we should be able to find out if we were correct. Sorry, more accurately, if the voters of Saskatchewan were correct in what they chose.
Correct. That's a rather obtuse way of saying if the voters of Saskatchewan agreed with Steve and I. Now, let's get into it. Yeah?
Let's do it.
So Vote Compass. I'm there at votecompass.com, and I realize that I can select from 3 active elections. One is in New Zealand, one is in British Columbia, which happened just yesterday, and the Saskatchewan provincial election. We're going to jump in. What's interesting is Steve and I both grew up in Saskatchewan, and so it's, he and I both have maybe a perspective to share regarding the Saskatchewan Party, regarding the New Democrat Party in Saskatchewan, the Progressive Conservative Party of Saskatchewan, and the Saskatchewan Green Party. That's interesting. So let's get started. My postal code, should we just skip this? I think so. Yeah?
Yes, skip.
We won't select a riding. We can just skip that. And the way that Vote Compass works is it presents us with a series of questions. How we answer these questions places us on some sort of political spectrum. And part of the reason Steve and I thought this would be fun is because our hypothesis is that the questions themselves are maybe coercive. Vote Compass is paid for by CBC on behalf of the various provinces and the federal government when they have elections. And does CBC inject some of their bias, I wonder? We might discover that as we talk through these questions. Steve, the first question, and we should try to limit our time on each one, but and by the way, as we go through each question, Steve and I are going to attempt to lay out the radical positions as well as the moderate positions on both the, let's say, left and right side of the political spectrum. The first question, Steve, how much money should welfare recipients get? And then there's a scale from much less to much more, or about the same as now is right there in the middle. How much money should welfare recipients get? Steve, go.
My knee-jerk reaction to that one is much less, but I guess I don't actually know what the atmosphere is like in Saskatchewan right now. Is there a lot of people becoming wealthy on welfare? And welfare is an interesting way to frame it. Does that mean unemployment, or does that mean social aid?
Yeah, I believe it's a social aid. It is a welfare program, not a employment insurance program.
So
Does it matter that we
my
don't
immediate
know the
thought,
current amount? Does the regular voter know the current amount? Probably not, unless they are themselves
yeah.
recipients. But if a voter doesn't know the current amount, I wonder. Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Carry on.
No, I would say somewhat less. I mean, if I was putting myself and saying, okay, if I had a candidate and they were saying we're going to work to curtail or make more efficient the amount that the government's spending on welfare, much less seems like the connotation is we're going to slash it, and I don't know that that is a good strategy in any situation, but status quo or increasing it, to me, never makes sense.
I wonder if you could speculate the reason for the question or the trajectory of this question. Okay, so people who might say there should be much more for welfare recipients, what do you think motivates that?
Well, I think the idea being that the government is has money and that it's important that they spend that money on helping those that are poor. Mm. And
And
that's something that's a position I would generally disagree with. Um,
so the way you've stated that sounds like a wealth distribution mechanism. The government has money because they've taken it from Canadians. So in this case, Saskatchewanites,
yeah,
and they should therefore give that money to people who don't have enough. So in that sense, it's not actually a social aid as much as it's a wealth distribution mechanism, perhaps, for some voters.
yeah.
People that would say much less, what do you think motivates that?
Well, it's the opposite end of the political spectrum, I suppose. You know, the government shouldn't interfere. That private enterprises, private individuals, churches, non-governmental associations should be the one to provide that kind of support to people when they need it.
So, how do we finish this question up? Do we answer much less, about the same as now, somewhat more, much more, or don't know?
Well, my my vote, if it were me answering on my own behalf, I would say somewhat less.
Let's go somewhat less. Oh, wrong window I'm touching. I think I just moved it around on the screen a little bit. There we go. How much should Saskatchewan do to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions? Much less, much more, somewhere in between. How much should Saskatchewan do to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions?
Hmm. You get the feeling we're not going to get a lot more specificity. I did note a pattern already. We're going to have you disagree vehemently, you agree passionately, or you're somewhere in the middle.
Yes. Or that you don't know. Every question gives you the right to pass. The Saskatchewan greenhouse gas emissions include a pretty vibrant oil and gas sector, a pretty vibrant mining sector, specifically potash mines. There's some manufacturing in the province, steel, for example, but not much. By the way, not much in the way of manufacturing. Otherwise, they're under. Oh, there's lots of farming, of course,
That's what I was
agriculture.
going to ask. Is that common? Uh, is that understood to be a pretty significant source of greenhouse gases, methane from cattle ranching?
There's not much cattle ranching in Saskatchewan
I guess
compared
that's true. Yeah.
to the neighboring Alberta. There's
Right.
some, but Saskatchewan is mostly crop farming. And then,
Which
of
would be
course, in
all of
the
your equipment. Yeah.
like half of the province is covered in forest, boreal forest. The furthest northern parts are some tundra, muskeg, and there's some uranium. There's some uranium mining up in the north.
Hmm.
Frankly, it's my opinion that Saskatchewan's very responsible energy industry, which has done remarkable things to make the production and refining of oil as, let's say, as clean as current regulations can allow. If Saskatchewan, and here's the argument, I think, from the conservative side of the spectrum. Here, conservatives generally, I think, would argue that Saskatchewan could have a thriving economy based on its energy resources that could then help finance Canada's growth and development, and in doing so, offset some of the very dirty oil production that occurs worldwide, particularly in regions of the world where there are known humanitarian crises. So, Saudi Arabia and China and various parts of the Middle East, Islamist nations and such that produce lots and lots of oil, and they do so without these same regulations. They do so without caps on emissions and things like that. So it's my opinion that Saskatchewan really doesn't need to do much more to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions uh, at all.
So maybe you you arrived via a different route, but at the same place. Are you saying somewhat less?
Yeah.
If anything, a bit of a curtailing of how, yeah, how forced those regulations are, or how, yeah.
Somewhat less.
Got my vote.
People who use illicit drugs should have access to supervised consumption sites. Disagree or agree? People who use illicit drugs should have access to supervised consumption sites.
Hmm.
What's the moderate and extreme position on the left and right of this? Give yourself like 30 seconds on each of those four categories.
Uh, I mean, I think your typical conservative would say no because they're probably anti-drug, maybe. And so they would say, heck no, we don't want we don't want to encourage drug use. That would be the concern, I suppose, at the end of the day, is by giving a place to do it, you're encouraging it. Um, and
Encouraging
then
or
at the
enabling?
enabling, maybe, yeah. At the opposite end of the spectrum is, you know, people who are addicted to illicit drugs, that it's a disease ultimately, and every other disease has a place in Saskatchewan to go and receive care uh, on the taxpayer's dime, and so why not the disease of and I guess you're not really seeking treatment. You're not seeking to overcome the addiction. You're just having a clean, supervised place to do it. So if you overdose, I guess ultimately someone's there to call 911 to provide care, to notice, rather than having that happen at home or somewhere else.
Yeah, this notion that diseases ought to be met with taxpayer-funded treatment. Part of that I can get behind. However, consumption sites are not treatment sites. They are consumption sites by definition. And there's, and by the way, I think that there's a more moderate conservative perspective around this as well. Sort of just a sheerly financial cost-benefit analysis can be done. The activities. Okay, so does a person who uses a safe consumption site do so the fact that they're supervised or doing so with clean utensils and implements prevent them from overdose or blood poisoning or other medical emergency that is then very costly.
Well, not to mention they can be found.
Yeah.
And intervention can happen that much earlier, and yeah.
Yeah. The other argument, I think, on probably the left side of the spectrum, the sort of the moderate left, I would argue, they would say a safe consumption site provides a contact point through which you can advocate for treatment, or that you can encourage treatment, or that you can provide information about treatment. That you can expose addicts to the resources and services that they would seek once they decide to change their addiction around.
Yeah.
So
my inclination there would be somewhat agree. I feel like strongly agree. I'm not a fan of socialized medicine personally, but I think even without socialized medicine, I think you could make an argument for all the reasons that you just stated. Why not have a place that people can come, more likely to be exposed to treatment options, more likely to have a better result should they overdose or get into trouble. And yes, maybe they're responsible for that themselves, but ultimately that's going to reduce the expense on the taxpayer from a perspective of how far they need to be transported, how complicated the transportation is, how severe the emergency becomes.
it doesn't affect all taxpayers evenly, though. Some taxpayers live in proximity with these sites. So, for example, my wife and I used to live in Toronto, east of the Don Valley Parkway, near Queen Street, and there's a shelter, there's a safe injection site, there were marijuana dispensaries in the neighborhood, and we would routinely see, while walking our daughter to elementary school, we would routinely see syringes and condoms literally in the alley and on the sidewalk, and so there are these elements that surround these sites that I think the proximate taxpayer have every reason and right to complain about if not taken care of, right? If not monitored effectively. So for that reason, I would somewhat disagree that these sites should exist, or that there should be more of them. Like maybe we have enough. Would we agree on neutral, or do you want to go somewhat agree?
Well, I don't want to fight you. So like a physical altercation or anything like that. So I would say maybe we split the middle and go neutral, because I'm not far off of neutral. I just
Next question.
And like you say, perhaps there is already enough of them.
Yeah. And I don't know that. I would say in parts of Toronto there certainly are enough. Parts of Vancouver, but actually don't know the detail in Saskatchewan. The provincial budget deficit should be reduced, even if it means fewer public services. Agree or not agree?
I've I've been doing this, so I live in the United States, and I've been doing a lot of studying and listening to a lot of podcasts and different things about our debt situation, and and it just politicians just seem to be in the mode of financing everything with debt, with very little thought of how that unravels, how that gets fixed later. It's been interesting. So the U.S. is in a situation where a great deal of austerity, not a great deal maybe, but some austerity, we would need to cut Social Security, which is, unthinkable to so many people, but we would need to cut Social Security, and we would need to back off on some of the unfunded liabilities and clamp back spending maybe just 10 or 15%, because we're pretty consistently 10% ahead of our intake. The government consistently spends about 10% more than it has to spend, and we would have to do those things, and then hope to keep inflation the interest rates fairly low. But the only way to keep suppressing the interest rates is to print money and devalue the currency. And so we're creating some sort of inflation consequence at some point. What I've noticed and I don't mean that, I grew up in Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan and Alberta, it seems that they're still early on in that debt situation. And maybe you can correct me, David, but that, like, it seems like Alberta and Saskatchewan, when I was growing up there 25 years ago, 35 years ago, it was consistently debt, debt, debt. And then there was a pretty significant oil boom.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, Alberta seemed like they had a surplus for a while. And
Even
maybe Saskatchewan was in the same boat
yeah,
a little bit.
yeah. Even Saskatchewan had a few years of surplus that
Yeah.
enabled them
But they
to.
still have significant long-term debt, though, right?
I don't know. I think so.
Yeah.
I want to say that I think this question is coercive. I think it's a really terrible false dichotomy being presented in this question. So let me just read it again. The provincial budget deficit should be reduced, even if it means fewer public services. The question makes a claim that the only way to reduce the budget deficit is to cut public services. I don't think that's the only choice on the table. I think that in Saskatchewan, for example, if there was a willingness to really explore the uranium mining, and if Canada would really explore nuclear electrical power production, instead of just bucking to the finger wagging about Chernobyl, like there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we can conduct nuclear power sites responsibly and safely, and doing so produces tons and tons of the electricity that people need. And so, as an example, if Saskatchewan were willing to exploit that resource in their north, or if Saskatchewan could negotiate better terms for the export of canola, rather than our federal government refused to really stand up to China in the past 2 years regarding the market, the world market for canola, and the pressure that the Chinese were putting in the market. I don't know all the details, but it was certainly part of our daily news for many months. If Saskatchewan could exploit its resources responsibly and negotiate better terms for trade of those resources, there wouldn't be a need for the budget deficit.
So,
And
so
there could be an abundance of public services. Why
Right.
why why does it have to be this false dichotomous trade-off?
So, because you're saying the CBC is posing the question like, you think the deficit should be reduced. Keep in mind, you would have to be a pretty mean person to want to
Right.
reduce public services and hurt people and take money out of their pockets, But
Yeah.
would you still want to do that, even if it required that kind of meanness? But to play devil's advocate, and so thereby saying that CBC is the devil, um, what if you just explained, well, if we had more input, if we had looser environmental regulations to some extent or whatever,
Not
and
not
could
even
create
not even looser regulations, just maybe
more willingness to tap
yeah,
some natural resources a little heavier?
yeah, or to reduce the burden of licensing and permitting of resource
Just
sites.
grease the wheels, loosen things up a little bit, sure.
Yeah,
So,
is
but
Saskatchewan
so if you
open for
did
business or
that
not?
and you had more money, then it goes without saying. It's like, well, now we can reduce the debt and we don't have to change anything in the status quo as far as government services. So maybe it is a reasonable question in that way. Is reducing the deficit more important than sustaining the status quo? In like, if there was no more new income and it required cutting some services, is that important enough to you to still reduce the debt? So maybe it's not a horrible question.
I think it's a horrible question. I do. I think the question is written to remind the voter of the typical boogeyman of the Conservative Party. Conservative parties generally don't like to be austere. They generally take a strategy of lowering taxes so that businesses can thrive. And that always looks like the threat of, oh, they're going to lower taxes and therefore they need to cut the services. And sometimes there's evidence of that where yeah, some services do get cut, but often there's evidence of the opposite as well.
Yeah.
The provincial budget deficit should be reduced even if it means fewer public services. How should we vote? Neutral, somewhat agree, somewhat disagree.
I'm on the fence between strongly and somewhat. It's always a good idea to reduce deficits, whether you come up with new sources of income, you learn to do things more efficiently. I mean, especially year-to-year deficits.
Yeah,
We already have.
I'm going to say strongly agree and put it to the provincial government to find creative ways to do so without reducing public services.
Fair enough.
How much money should the federal government redistribute from provinces that have more to those that have less? Ooh, the equalization question. Saskatchewan, I believe, is now considered a have province. I believe when you and I were younger, it was a have not. Is that what you remember?
Yeah, the general consensus would have been, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta.
Yeah.
Yep. I strongly disagree. I don't need a whole lot of time to. You put redistribute right in the question, and the federal government trying to manipulate. I mean, because that's just loaded with unintended consequences, right? We got to keep the provinces equal. You've got population differences, you've got sociological differences, you've got environmental differences, you've got natural resources differences, and then you have the ability. I mean, as far as I know, you can still move province to province, no papers in Canada, and you're not restricted. You don't have to live in the province you're in, and so when economic circumstances dictate, you're going to see natural migrations of people back and forth, generationally, people going after better opportunities somewhere else. And so the government trying to put marionette strings on all the provinces and somehow equalize them out, just terrible idea, in my opinion.
I agree. I think it's not an opinion I would have shared, let's say, even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Although I will say that growing up, it always did feel weird to me that some provinces who do well, and they do well by, let's say, architecting their business environment to, to allow the exploitation of some resources, and they allow business activity, they support it in various ways. It always felt weird to me that they would have to spread that money through the federal government to other provinces who also, by the way, have tons and tons of natural resources available and tons of people. Quebec is always, I guess, an easy target for criticism because it's a massive province geographically, very large population, compared to other provinces, and yet somehow they're continually a have-not province that is the recipient of untold billions from the West. And so, like you said, the marionette strings of the federal government can be sort of rigged in, and there isn't a lot of transparency, by the way, about how those numbers are reported and calculated, and it's a mess. I'm going to say much less.
Agreed. Yep.
Okay, Saskatchewan's budget should be balanced, no matter what. Agree strongly, disagree strongly.
I think I would be neutral to somewhat agree on that. I don't know that. I mean, ideally, yes. I think that you have some sense of austerity and you have some sense of fiscal responsibility, and you do your best to run on the money that you take in and have a balanced budget. I mean, that's economics 101, budgeting 101. However, COVID is probably a good example, regardless of how you feel about COVID specifically or the reactions you're going to have emergencies potentially come up, and there needs to be probably some wiggle room, although government tends to use wiggle room pretty liberally.
Yeah, I think I've changed on this point. I think I would have said neutral or disagree, that it's probably okay if a government borrows from time to time, and they run a deficit for a couple of years, and maybe it's okay that they run a deficit through the election cycle and leave the next party with a big debt to repay. And I've changed actually in my recent year or two, probably. I want to say that I strongly agree that the province's budget should be balanced no matter what. And the reason for that is that I've come to understand that any deficit whatsoever, any debt carried by a province, a federal government, a family, an individual, is always a loan on our future. Someone, some amount of effort in future is being levied in order to make surplus today, or have financial liquidity today. Even in the case of this pandemic, for example, which I agree probably requires some spending that was unanticipated. But if a government, let's say, wasn't allowed to run a deficit, if it was unconstitutional or illegal to do so, I think there would be, in this case, a better balance struck between lockdown measures versus health spending versus get the businesses flowing again. You know, like we in this country right now have politicians that clearly think we can just not allow businesses to operate indefinitely. And they place unconstitutional restrictions on many businesses to the point that they're going bankrupt by the thousands every month, and that's catastrophic. If we weren't allowed to run a deficit, our politicians would be forced to find other means, other ways, and maybe think more creatively. I don't mean maybe think more creatively. I mean
You
they'd have to think more
they'd be
creatively.
forced to. Okay, you've convinced me on that point. Yeah, they can go begging to the federal government for money in an emergency. They could, worst case, they could issue some kind of special levy, which would then further would cause people to have even more buy-in. It's like, okay, every taxpayer that makes over X amount has to pony up an extra $1,000 this year because we don't have it. And we can't spend, or to create rainy day funds and to better manage,
Yeah.
special funds for those types of emergencies and stuff, proactively. You've convinced me. I definitely strongly agree.
Okay, cool. Public sector workers should not be allowed to strike. Disagree or agree?
I got to plead the fifth on that. I think I'm neutral. That's so loaded.
Yeah.
I don't agree with how.
Okay, so let's agree right now that either we don't know or we'll vote neutral on this. But let's think about the ends of those spectrum. Okay, public sectors should be allowed to strike or should not be allowed to strike. What's motivating those two trajectories?
God, such a complicated issue. It's like I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so I mean, because at the one end of the spectrum you say strongly agree, and now you're saying so anybody that works for the government is an indentured servant. That they have no latitude, that they shouldn't have the same working conditions or the same opportunities to use collective bargaining or whatever that any other private employee would have. And that the other way to consider that too is now, so you're saying the government should be allowed to operate a business with a complete and clear unfair advantage compared to any other, any other private enterprise, and so then that just further pulls apart. It further, to me, it further entrenches the whatever becomes socialized. If insurance industry is socialized, the medical industry is socialized, and then you create an unfair competitive advantage by saying that the employees there aren't able to use collective bargaining, then that just spreads that. Like, it makes it more and more difficult for a private enterprise to come in and ever compete with that, even if they went through the motions of decentralizing or de-socializing that or privatizing it. I mean, I've almost talked myself into strongly agree or strongly disagree that they should,
Well, okay, but let's reread the question word for word.
Sure.
Public sector workers should not be allowed to strike. So the question is not explicitly about unions. Is it? Like, I know it is, but what if it isn't? Like, what if, does that change anything?
I'm not sure it does. I mean, you can't strike by yourself successfully.
So it's about
It takes,
collective action.
yeah, it takes some kind of collective action to strike.
So the reason this question is being asked is to suss out whether a person is in favor of unions or not in favor of unions, and also in favor of, I guess, enforcing like public sector workers include police and first responders and firefighters and such, and those are often deemed essential services, and so they're not allowed to strike, right?
But that would include SGI claims adjusters then in this case.
Right. Yeah. Teachers are a good example. So this is interesting because teachers in Ontario, I think, routinely shoot themselves in the foot because their unions choose the most opportune times to strike when it's going to hurt parents the most. It's bizarre. I don't know why they do this, but they'll strike, at the beginning of a school year, or coming back from a Christmas holiday when the parents are, and they'll announce it with on very short notice, and so parents are scrambling to get other arrangements made for their kids, and it'll go on for weeks on end and indefinite. And like there are other kinds of job action that I think teachers could take that don't shoot themselves in the foot in this way. They certainly don't get a lot of sympathy from many parents across the province.
I don't know. It's a question that cuts both ways because you could say, well, if I'm for smaller government or more limited government, then I don't want public sector workers in the first place
Okay.
as much.
Okay. Yeah. Good point. So what about a collective bargaining unit in a private company? Like the fact that they're asking about public sector workers is important. As you know, Saskatchewan has numerous crown corporations, and a long history of crowns. So it makes sense that they're asking about public sector workers. But if a collective in a private company decided they're going to go and stand on a picket line, a private company would have every reason and right to just stop employing those people, right? That would be the prerogative of the private corporation.
Right. And the idea of collective bargaining is, well, if all of us quit at the same time, that's not going to be tenable for the company. So it kind of forces them to the bargaining table.
Right. Or the company calls their bluff. One way or other, there's a bluff being shouldered.
It's an exercise of influence both ways.
Right. In a public sector, that bluff doesn't exist, I don't think, in the same way that the public sector workers are provided so many protections for guaranteed employment or tenure that they're really just holding a taxpayer at hostage.
You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want this robust, teeming public sector full of employees, why should they be able to compete on an unlevel playing field with private companies?
Okay.
I don't know. And I can see the argument for first responders, medical, even teachers to some extent, but when you've got, you know, thousands and thousands of Crown employees, um, I don't like the question, and it's frustrating my mind.
Yeah. So public sector workers should not be allowed to strike. How do we want to?
Maybe that's a legit don't know for me.
Yeah.
Tell you one thing, David Sabine.
Mm-hmm.
How long are we into this live broadcast?
I don't know. 45 minutes. So we got to speed it up a bit.
We're at 12%. We're gonna have to be pretty pithy on the conversation here for a few questions.
Class sizes in provincial schools should be smaller, even if it costs taxpayers more.
Strongly disagree. Malcolm Gladwell.
More? Tell me more.
There's pretty good evidence that small class size. No, what did he studied that out and looked at a lot of data, and smaller class size increases quality of learning, but only to an extent. And then there's a certain class size around 25 or 30 where it actually inverts, and you go down to a class size of 12 or 15, and the quality of learning, or the results of the quality of learning is actually diminished, because you don't have as much socialization, you don't have as many different ideas. I don't think suppressing class size is a reasonable or correct or effective measure of the quality of education in and of itself.
Yeah, I agree, particularly in the secondary schools. I think at the younger grades, they just require so much attention generally that the class sizes ought to be balanced. But they generally are balanced with educational assistants in the classroom and such. Again, I don't like the question. I think it's very coercive. It shows a lot of bias. There's no reason it has to cost more.
Even if it costs more, there's a lot.
Yeah, like there is so much waste.
Even if.
Yeah, there is so much waste in that system. Schools that are paying for, so much money goes into administrative costs rather than directly to the classrooms. Like it's a huge bureaucracy that is terribly expensive, and I think better management of the funds would be effective. So class sizes in provincial schools should be smaller. I'm going to say somewhat disagree.
I'm happy with that.
Indigenous peoples should have more control over their ancestral territory.
What I understood when I was leaving Saskatchewan, and that's been 25 years ago, so a lot of water has gone under the bridge on that subject since I've been there, and I don't profess to know what the current politics are, or the landscape, but is it not true that basically all of Saskatchewan, possibly twice over, is ancestral home, promised in the form of multiple treaties? I mean, or is that a fair statement?
I don't know if that's a fair statement. I do think it's accurate that it's treaty land, and I really don't know enough about the legal claims made throughout the past couple of 100 years, and therefore the current state of these negotiations.
So I guess that's my question is, don't Indigenous peoples have basically complete autonomy over reserve land?
That's not their ancestral territory, might be the argument. So maybe the question here is not about reserve land, it's about ancestral territory.
So isn't that more a question of, so reserve land's insufficient and there should be more territory, which would ultimately be crown land, needs to be put into the control of indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of the positions I hear from our Green Party, in particular, in our House of Commons, federally. So Elizabeth May, her rhetoric over the past few years, at least that's when I've started to notice it, is really turned toward this notion that Canada, this geography is essentially the ancestral territory of various First Nations, and Europeans came and colonized it. So, like, she literally refers to you and I as colonialists, which is in my, and I'm going to get in trouble online for saying this, but I think that's an absurd term, given that I was brought into this world in Walsh Acres, at the whatever longitude and latitude that is. I didn't choose that. I didn't colonize this place. I appeared. I was born. And that's my home. It's my home as much as it's anyone's home living in that part of the world today. There's a long history of other people who lived there and called it their home. And that history is filled with negotiations and trades and wars and battles. And this question, I think, speaks to I think, a revisionist version of that history. And as you said in our previous video that we recorded today, you talked about being a protagonist against villains that are defined for us by journalists. And I think in this case, there are historians or journalists willing to paint certain categories of people as villains against the Indigenous protagonist here.
So, so devil's advocate again. So you make the argument, I was born in Canada. I assume that's true of your parents as well,
Yeah,
and my parents as well.
and their
So,
parents.
and their parents, in my case, that's true of me as well, 3 generations back. So now juxtapose that to the southern border issue in the United States. So you have someone from South America, 8 months pregnant, by hook or by crook or by whatever means, gets across the border, has the baby in the United States.
Yeah.
That baby is now a U.S. citizen,
Yep.
and that baby's not colonial. That baby's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and so you say, well, that's not the same thing, because that's first generation. And so is there a generational cutoff? Is
I
there
don't know.
so many generations and then the past is washed away and forgiven? I mean, if we had been born in 1810 or 1780 or whatever, and on the frontier, and politically all of the indigenous peoples were collectively more politicized, or collectively more politically adept, and said, you know what, this is actually our land, and we'd like you to just get out of here. You could make the argument that they'd be on pretty good ground at that point, saying, well, I guess that's true. I mean, or else we're going to destroy you or murder you to take your land, and that's pretty unreasonable. And ultimately, I you can make a pretty good argument that that's really what happened everywhere. But now,
No,
how many
no,
generations does
I
it?
think that that's a distortion of, so that certainly happened, okay? But I think it's also true that some people got together very sincerely to negotiate and trade and work out some arrangements. And some of that was under duress, no doubt. Some of it was honest, no doubt. Uh, it's a it's I don't know on this question.
I don't know. This is exactly why we created the podcast, right? We're going to have some guests,
Yeah,
and we can go into some in-depth discussions because every one of these questions
yeah.
just creates an in-depth discussion.
Oh,
Speaking of which, I'm sure the election results are almost available at this
yeah.
point.
How much should wealthier people pay in taxes? Let's limit ourselves to 2 minutes
Are
on
we going to
this.
the lightning round? Lightning round.
Lightning round.
Okay.
How much should wealthier people pay in taxes? This ranges from much more to much less. And you can guess about, about the middle is now, or the same as now, somewhat more, somewhat less, much less.
Somewhat less.
I agree. How much money should the provincial government how much money should the provincial government spend to try to prevent suicides in Saskatchewan? This ranges from much less to much more.
I think I'm neutral on that. I don't know how much they spend currently. I I don't know how much government spending can move the needle on that issue personally.
I'm aware of programs that they have in place that appear to be having some, let's say, moderate effect. But I agree
So
with
let
your
me
statement
qualify.
here. I don't
Yeah,
think spending is really, you're not going to spend your way out of this problem. What,
right.
but there needs to be other kinds of supports in the communities. Um, maybe it has more to do with trying to keep families together or
Yeah.
avoid unwanted relationships or unwanted pregnancies or there's a whole host of issues here that are far bigger than money.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say about the same as now would be my partly because I don't know the amount.
But I think in a general sense, uh, like if they spent zero money and we're talking about should they create some programs, some government, I think they should, but there certainly is some
Yeah,
already. And I don't know how much more you can move the needle by just throwing more money at it than already. I mean, it's been an issue for decades, obviously. And I mean, there's some well-established government programs, and they could probably do quite a bit with what's there. So about the same as now, I'm good. Remember, we are in the lightning round.
Saskatchewan's roads should be maintained by government workers, not private contractors.
Strongly disagree. Why
I'm with
wouldn't?
you on that.
Why can't road work be done by private contractors?
Yeah, and why does government have to be so large that it maintains a monopoly on that kind of skilled work?
Yeah, yeah.
How much tax should large corporations pay? This ranges between much less to much more.
My gut would be somewhat less. I mean, you don't slash them. Corporations, should be on the hook for taxes, but you look at the numbers, the economics of it, you give moderate tax breaks to, you know, influential people and influential corporations, and you attract more of the same, and that creates entrepreneurship, it creates
Yeah.
innovation, it creates economic activity.
Yeah, so the large corporations in Saskatchewan, many of them in the resource sector also pay royalties on the resources themselves. That's separate from the tax structure. And I agree with that. I'm with you that large corporations could pay somewhat less and don't need to be penalized for being employers of large numbers of people who also pay
Unless
income
they get
taxes and
unless they get large enough, and then they qualify as a crown corporation, then they don't pay any taxes. They spend taxes.
somewhat less for that. Saskatchewan should scrap the carbon tax.
I'm all for that.
Okay. I do agree with Elon Musk's presentation at the Paris 2014 or 2015 conference, where I do agree that there is a unaccounted for byproduct of certain industrial activity. Here's a bunch of industrial activity, and it creates a byproduct for which no one pays for its disposal or maintenance. And I think there's a place for that, but I think the current carbon tax actually just penalizes the wrong people. It penalizes farmers, and it doesn't change behavior. It doesn't change the consumer behavior whatsoever. I'm with you on strongly agree. How much?
Point of order.
Yeah,
It says we're on 14 of 30, but we're only 22% complete. Is there essay questions? All right,
I don't know.
just an observation.
How much say should federal government have over how Saskatchewan conducts its affairs? Somewhat more, somewhat less, much more, much less.
How much the federal government over what Saskatchewan does?
Yeah, how much say should the federal government have over how Saskatchewan conducts its affairs?
Much less, as little as possible.
I agree. And I wouldn't have
And
agreed with
and
that.
Saskatchewan should have less control over how the RMs conduct their business.
Yeah, I'm gradually, I've gradually come to that same position, much less. People should be able to pay for faster access to medical treatment. Strongly agree or strongly disagree?
I think I strongly agree with. I mean, that's the to me that's just poking holes in the armor of socialized medicine,
Which you're against.
which I'm against in the first place. So that's a personal bias, I suppose. But it's like, so if socialized medicine is the solve all and the utopia, then why would people be seeking to spend their money outside of that system on getting better care or more or faster care?
Yeah.
And ultimately, like, yeah.
Okay,
and
so
and so
here's my rationale.
yeah.
If the system was meeting its demand or meeting the demand, then everyone would have access to fast and abundant and excellent medical care. If it's not meeting that demand, people ought to have an option. So and the fact that they have an option hopefully presses on the system itself to recognize the competition and
Yeah.
meet the
One other
competition.
one other little intricacy to that is people always have an option. People can leave the country. I mean, if they're wealthy enough,
Yeah.
no matter what quality of care they're receiving in Canada, even if that was excellent, even if it was beyond the standards of 97% of the countries, if someone was wealthy enough,
Yeah.
then they would go seek care and pay for it in one of that last 3% of the countries that happen to be better. So there's always that option. The question is, are you going to, as people seek that option, are you going to force them to leave the country in every case?
Yeah.
Or why shouldn't private enterprise be able to come in and fill that gap and say, well, if people are leaving and jumping the border to go to the US to get CAT scans, why don't we get a CAT scan machine and offer it, you know what I mean? Offer it here, or why wouldn't the government do that for themselves and say, yeah, if you guys want to pay per service, then we can certainly afford to bring one of those in. Let's do it.
Yeah. I'm with you. So what did you say? Strongly
Okay.
agree?
Yep.
Saskatchewan should make the use of masks in provincial schools mandatory. Oh, I think you know my response to this already.
I think you know mine.
Strongly disagree.
Yep.
Do you want to summarize that in 30 seconds?
Well, why are we talking about this? Why is this an election issue?
Right. Yeah. This should be and you know, there's so much data now that children are not the ones at risk. They're not the ones spreading it. You know, people. So my children here in elementary school are having to be, they're forced to wear masks every day, and it breaks my heart every morning to put them on the school bus and they're having to wear their mask. Like
Yeah.
they come home and their skin is all dried up in here, and they're seeing grown-ups in masks and things all day long. Like it's like that scene in E.T. when Elliot was coming home and he saw the whole house covered in plastic and, you know, people walking around with hazmat suits. Do you remember the fear you felt for E.T.?
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
I can imagine the fear our children feel, and they have no reason to feel it because there's such little risk, and that's been proven out by the data published by the CDC and even the World Health Organization. You know, the 0.13% is the average fatality rate of this thing, and those tend to be people with 2.6 or more comorbidities. And like we've all seen this data now. Journalists tend to ignore it or spin it some other way. But anyway, Saskatchewan should build nuclear reactors to generate electricity for the province. I've already stated.
Everybody should.
Yeah, strongly agree.
Yes.
How much debt should the Saskatchewan government incur to address the COVID-19 crisis? Much more, much less? What do you think?
Much less. We've already discussed through that point, right? We talked
Yeah.
about it specifically.
Yeah. How difficult should it be to own a semi-automatic rifle in Saskatchewan? A semi-automatic rifle in Saskatchewan.
I don't think it should be terribly difficult.
Okay, but hold on. Semi-automatic rifles cannot be owned in Saskatchewan unless they are 22 caliber rim fire, I think is the, like, so this question is again, it's a coercive question because it makes it sound like it's like that you can own a semi-automatic rifle, and you can't unless it's
So
very
it's pretty
specific.
difficult.
Like
It's pretty difficult right now.
it's very difficult right now. Like, but if you don't know that, you're going to read this question and say, yes, it should be more difficult.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, how difficult should it be to own a semi-automatic rifle in Saskatchewan? My actual opinion is either somewhat less or about the same as now.
Somewhat less.
With you. How many privately owned liquor stores should there be in Saskatchewan? Many more, many fewer.
I mean, many more. That's mostly the microbrewery issue and stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what? That's just a good that's a good example of why can't you have competition and privatization of an industry like that, just like the road work. It's like the government needs to have a monopoly and needs to have complete autonomous control of how liquor is sold.
It's yeah, there's no reason that our government needs to be so big that it employs, you know, tens of thousands of people to sell liquor to its citizens.
Yeah.
No new oil pipelines should be built in Saskatchewan. Strongly agree or strongly disagree?
Strongly disagree. I mean, no new at all. I mean,
That's,
that's,
yeah, a moratorium.
yeah.
I strongly disagree that there should be a moratorium. The provincial government should restore funding for intercity bus transit in Saskatchewan.
Oh, the STC that, well, how
Yeah.
long ago did that stop running?
Well, and then they paid Greyhound or some other company as a contractor to do it. You know, they subsidized it heavily so that people could get out to the various
Yeah.
isolated regions. The provincial government should restore funding for intercity bus transit in Saskatchewan.
Somewhat agree. My reasoning there would be there's a long history in Saskatchewan of because you've got a very spread out, sparsely populated area, the government's always spent money on building roads that benefit very few people, building infrastructure, telecommunications, power that benefit very few people. And so really busing is, I mean, to me, that's, I mean, I think it can't be like overdone or, you know, a blank check, but somewhat agree. I think there's room for that.
Not like maybe an allowance for charter services or you know, because the
Yeah,
bus the transit service was also a complement to courier,
right.
right?
Yeah, it was an option to send things. Yeah, yeah,
And so Amazon, for example, has now been approved for drone delivery. They're going to do it far more effectively and efficiently than a bus service.
yeah.
So the
Not,
courier thing isn't needed anymore. To me, it's really about, you know, human transport.
yeah,
And I think charter services could take care of that more uniquely and locally. That's my opinion.
yeah. I guess the question is, should the government subsidize it a little bit?
I agree
Because
with
there's going to
that.
be because there's going to be routes that just aren't profitable, and
I,
so they won't
so,
be
for
available
example,
anymore.
maybe any money spent for, you know, for such travel is a tax deduction, total tax deduction.
Perhaps, yeah,
Maybe like a northern resident tax bracket that's more aggressive. I think I would agree with that, so that the people have money in their pocket for that transportation.
sure.
So I'm going to say, see, again, it's a coercive question because I don't like the option of bus transit. I don't think that's the right option, but I think helping people financially to travel is perfectly appropriate through a strategy such as lowering their taxes. Provincial government should restore funding for intercity bus transit. Strongly disagree.
Oh, I thought we were going down the road of somewhat agree.
I don't think it should be for intercity bus transit.
Oh, inner city, but yeah, okay, yeah, yep,
Okay, somewhat disagree.
okay.
How much funding should post-secondary students receive from the provincial government? Much less, much more, about the same as now. Just so you know, it's been a long time since you left Saskatchewan.
Yes.
Tuition has increased gradually for the past couple of decades at least. I don't know what is the cost of a tuition per semester these days, but I'm going to guess it's around $6,000. Whereas when you and I in the early 90s were entering college age, I think the tuition was about $1,000 per semester.
Yeah. I would say about the same as now. I don't know that.
Sure.
Problem with that, that's a whole conversation,
Ooh,
and we're in the
how
lightning round.
high should the minimum wage be? How high should the minimum wage be? Much lower, much higher? About the same as now.
I would I would go the same way we went on a lot of those other economic questions, somewhat less.
And not that we want people to not be earning more money.
But
I certainly don't want that.
yeah, I'm not a minimum wage fan, and that's a really complex question, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Could you describe why in 10 seconds?
Uh, there's a significant need in the economy for entry level jobs, and and the labor rates need to be supported by the value. I mean, people should be able to go out and earn whatever value they have, and if and they should have the option and of earning less.
Okay, so somewhat lower. Private religious schools in Saskatchewan should not receive government funding. Strongly agree or strongly disagree? Of course, they're asking about the Catholic system here, but it extends to any private religious school. It used to be the Catholic system sort of exclusively, but now there are many other religions.
I would say somewhat or strongly disagree. I mean, if you're paying taxes and that's used to fund the school system, and you're in an alternative school system because of religious belief, why
Yeah.
shouldn't there be some subsidization of that?
Okay, so what's your strongly disagree or strongly agree?
What's the question?
Private religious schools in Saskatchewan should not receive government funding.
I would say strongly disagree.
Oh, I would say strongly agree.
So the only schools that should receive government funding are government schools? I guess unless you're able to get, I mean, and I guess, so you're able to get credits or vouchers or go to the school of your choice,
Okay,
but
so
but vouchers
I think,
amount to funding, right?
yeah, I think that there's a conversation to be had here around funding, maybe putting the money directly in the hands of parents that would normally go into the public school system for their children. I think there's a conversation to be had around that. What I don't like about private religious schools receiving public money is that it's a special interest group, and there are an infinite number of those that would love to have taxpayer money to operate in a market that I feel should be more competitive.
Strongly agree. You've convinced me.
Wow. Wow. Didn't think I'd be able to. Hey, rural trespassing laws infringe on Aboriginal hunting rights. Strongly agree or disagree or don't know?
I would say somewhat agree. I think there needs to be strong property rights protection, but I know there's some gray there.
So strong, somewhat agree?
Yeah.
By the way, I'm playing with my dog over here, so that's why and he's really eager to, and he's going to start making noise if I don't. How much should the Saskatchewan government invest in renewable energy? Much less, much more, about the same as now?
One more time? Sorry, how much?
How much should the Saskatchewan government invest in renewable energy?
I'd say neutral. I know they're investing probably a fair bit,
Yeah.
and I just don't know that you ratchet that up. Put it into nuclear.
Yeah, I'm agree. About the same as now, let's say.
Yep.
Like I think there's a place for long-term investment strategy here to foster some innovation. But anyway, moving on. The provincial government should provide funding so that parents pay no more than $25 a day for childcare.
No, no, that's too much artificial manipulation that would be required to get there. I mean, you could make the case for some kind of funding and subsidization and whatever, but to say this is what it is, you're just asking for the prices to go out of control, for the government's share of that to get out of control and just add to waste, in my opinion.
I yeah, I'm torn here. I'm going to somewhat agree with you. Okay, so that means that I somewhat disagree to the question. Can we go with somewhat disagree?
Absolutely. I'm good with that.
The Saskatchewan government should share resource revenues with First Nations.
So I've got a lot of ignorance on that
Yeah, I don't know.
front.
I
I
mean,
mean, how much of the resource revenue from Indigenous lands? I mean, does that all go directly to the Indigenous people? I would assume it does, to their governments,
I don't know.
autonomously, and so
Yeah,
so
I'm just naive on this. I'm
yeah,
ignorant to this. Can we say don't know?
don't know.
So that was 30 out of 30. Oh, hold on.
But we're only halfway through the process.
Okay, so how trustworthy do you find Ryan Maley?
Okay, I don't know any of these guys, so
Don't
just
know?
based on his facial features alone,
Sure, I guess. Because that's how many voters will vote.
I have the added. We've got a slight lag here, so I'm looking at the screen over there. From 10 feet away in a 2-inch thumbnail picture, I would say he's a 7 out of 10 on trustworthiness.
How trustworthy do you find Naomi Hunter?
Oh, see, now I see his larger picture. I would have went with a 5. Uh-oh.
I can back up. I'll go 5.
Okay.
Give me a number for the Green Party leader.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go 8 on that. He's got an honest eyebrows.
How trustworthy do you find Scott Moe? Anybody?
6.
I'm gonna say 7. I'm gonna increase that.
Oh,
a bit,
really?
yeah.
Okay.
How
All right.
trustworthy do you find Ken Gray?
That looks like a pretty straight shooter.
I don't even know. So what do you want to say? 7?
7.
Okay. How? Oh, gosh. Can we just say don't know for these and get to the
Yep.
end? Okay.
Yep.
Don't know. Don't know. Don't know. Don't know. Regardless of the party you intend to vote for, in general, how likely are you to support the Saskatchewan party? Can we just say don't know?
Yep.
Don't know. Don't know. Don't know. Don't know. Oh
That's
my.
good. So we stayed neutral there, and we're basing this on the issues,
Yeah.
our results.
Okay. If the Saskatchewan provincial party, do I have to answer these? Skip. There we go. Calculating the result. How we fit in the political landscape. Ooh, look at that. So we are very right-leaning, somewhere between the Saskatchewan Party and the Progressive Conservatives. And let's leave it at that for now. I want to take the dog out for a walk because I think he's anxious.
All right.
There's further analysis here we could do, but hey, that was really fun just to talk through some of those topics and get a sense
Well,
from
now I'm
you
going to
of.
go look up the election results.
Oh yeah, can we do that?
I wouldn't want to leave our viewers,
Okay,
in
so
but technically we don't have any
Saskatchewan
viewers, so
public. So Saskatchewan election results. I don't know how we're going to find election results. I guess that's the one. Live real-time results, global news. Whoa, Saskatchewan party majority. There we go. So that's Scott Moe and
That was our
friends.
second choice after Progressive Conservatives, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hey, we did good.
We did pretty good. Yep. Now, I think actually I think it is true we lean further, both you and I are probably
Yeah.
further to the right of even the Saskatchewan party, which by the way was not true when I lived in the province. Okay, when I actually lived in Saskatchewan, I voted NDP. That's what my grandfather voted. My grandfather was an exceedingly sensible person, and I thought, well, why wouldn't I agree with my granddad? And that was just, I think I was just a NDP by default.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then, I've, yeah, I mean, my political history is meandering, to say the least. But I've certainly changed my way of thinking on most issues of late.
I think, I mean, that's an interesting conversation we could have sometime too, but I think just generally,
Yeah.
people tend to drift right as they age.
Look at this. It's all like every riding in the southern part of this, except the urban centers. Of course, parts of the cities are NDP, Saskatoon, a little bit. But the north, look at that. The north is NDP. Steve, I'm going to hang up.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed our conversation. So that's our first stream done. We're going to figure out how to publish this and announce it and get people involved for future streams. And let's call it a night.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. Good night.
Good night, Steve.